going to talk to you about a project I've been working on for a while with Kathy Thomas and Nick Young with some help from Leonardo. And what's, I guess, unique about this project is one of the things that we did was develop a dynamic link between STSEM and a fire behavior model, FARSITE. So first I want to give you a little background on the project. So there were several management questions that we were interested in related to this project. So there's multiple interacting ecological processes that affect ecosystems. And one of these is invasive species. And several of the questions that managers asked are, how big is the problem? What management strategies may work best to control invasive species? And what uncertainties exist that may affect management decisions that we might need to go out and do research on? So this could be used to guide future research questions. So the example that I'm going to talk about today involves work that we did in Saguaro National Park with bufflegrass, which is an African perennial bunch grass that's been invading the Sonoran Desert. It's been introduced around the world as a forage species. And one of the biggest concerns is that it might transform the fire regime in the region. So it provides a continuous fuel for fire, and it actually has a pretty high biomass. So it provides a lot of fuel for fires. And the ecosystem that it's invading isn't fire adapted. So the study site I'm going to talk about is Saguaro National Park, which is situated on either side of Tucson, Arizona. And what I'm going to focus on today is the eastern unit, which has a lot larger topographic variation than the western unit does. And a lot of the fire questions are more of an issue in that eastern unit. So we developed a state and transition model working with resource managers at the park and those from the area that also work with bufflegrass. So what our state classes consist of are kind of the uninvaded area within the park. And then we have different cover levels of bufflegrass, and these correspond either to fuel loads, like how much bufflegrass is required to carry a fire, or to cover classes that relate to management decisions. So maybe they can't treat anything that's less than 1% because there's too few plants on the landscape. And so from left to right, we have increasing covers of bufflegrass, where we have a seed bank, less than 1% cover, 1 to 10, 10 to 50, and greater than 50. Along the top row, we have undetected bufflegrass patches on the landscape. The next row down is ones that have been detected. And the reason that we have it separated like that is because you have to know that bufflegrass exists on the landscape before you can go out and treat it. And so the transitions between those relate to inventory, where people go out and map where bufflegrass is found. Other transitions where you move from the right back to the left involve treatment activities within the park. And here they thought that the efficacy of all treatments were similar. And so we don't distinguish between different types of treatment. But that can move you back down. And then on the far right, we have a category called converted, and bufflegrass moves into this category when a fire occurs, because before you have a fire, you still have native vegetation that can exist with the bufflegrass understory, and after a fire, it can become a bufflegrass monoculture. And it can be a lot harder, like you have to have active restoration to go back in and restore the landscape, versus with treatment, where there's still the native community there, it can recover on its own without active restoration. So this is the basic state and transition model that we used. We did divide the landscape into vegetation zones. So these were our main strata. And these consisted of what we called susceptible versus unsusceptible desert. And this was based on a habitat suitability model for bufflegrass, where the susceptible desert is where the model predicted that bufflegrass could survive. And then you'll also notice there's a third class there called grassland. And within the eastern unit of the park that we focused on, you have the desert community at lower elevations. And as you move up in elevation, there's a grassland zone that separates that desert community from the forest community. And so one of the interests with the park is how bufflegrass might provide fuel for fires that could then spread into that grassland community and potentially up into that forest community, and how could bufflegrass affect the fire spread rates. Another layer that we used defined the park as far as treatment zones. So this relates to the cost of treatment for an area. So you have areas that are easily accessible on the ground versus areas that are accessible on the ground but are more difficult to get to, so it's more costly. And then there's also several areas in the park where it's just not feasible to get into on foot to do treatment. And so those areas require aerial spraying. And another input we had to the model was where bufflegrass currently exists on the landscape to initialize the models. So in adding fire into the system, we used fire fuel models from land fire to define the fuel loads of the different cover classes of the uninvaded types. And then the fire ecologist at the park had actually crosswalked those different bufflegrass cover classes that we have as our states to different fuel loads that we also used. And one thing I wanted to point out is that this change made our model a lot more complicated. So you can see a screenshot of the state and transition model over on the right. And all that we did was those uninvaded and seed bank states, we had to crosswalk to different fire fuel models. And so we ended up with 5 times as many of those state classes in the model. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we developed a dynamic linkage between STSIM and FARSITE. So here's a screenshot that just shows the different parameters that we could fill out that were provided by STSIM to FARSITE. And so the way that this worked was at each time step, STSIM would perform all the transitions for that time step, and then it would make a call to FARSITE and provide information on the fuel loads related to the state classes that had existed at the end of that time step. FARSITE would run the fire behavior model to determine the perimeter of where fires occurred on the landscape, and then that information was provided back to STSIM, and that could be used to define where the fire transitions happened on the landscape. And so the information that we provided to FARSITE included topography, average weather conditions, the fuel loads associated with the state classes, fuel moisture information. So a lot of different parameters went into that. So I'm going to go through just some of the results that we obtained through that related to fire and the main management questions that we had that I mentioned earlier. So one of them was, how big was the fire, or how big is the problem? And so what this graph is showing is we have invaded area on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the time. So we ran the model for 30 time steps. The blue line shows simulations without fire, and the red is only with fire. And the different boxes represent different uncertainties that we had related to the initialization of the model. So for some of the buffalo grass state classes, we know that they didn't know where everything was on the landscape, so we randomly scattered some undetected locations across the landscape. So we varied the amount that we scattered. And then the other relates to that habitat suitability map that we used to define what areas were susceptible. And so we had kind of a base suitability and then a somewhat lower suitability where less of the landscape was suitable, and then a somewhat higher one where more of the landscape was suitable. And so this is just a way to look at how that uncertainty might affect the models. And the reason that we only ran fire for like the low, base, and high relates to the computational issues associated with the FARSITE linkage that I'll explain more at the end. Another way that we looked at how fire might influence results was the amount in each of the different state classes related to buffalo grass that existed on the landscape at the end of the run. So 2014 was the start of the model, so all those values are going to be similar. And then we had the run without fire and with fire. And so as it relates to the parks management goals, having the fire on the landscape shows that a lot of the landscape would be converted by the end of that time period, which one of their biggest management goals is maintaining saguaro cacti across the landscape, which is the namesake of the park. And so when you get into that converted category, you no longer have saguaros. So adding fire in was a important component for that reason. And in all but, so the, from left to right here, what it's showing is uncertainty related to both how wet the climate is, as that can affect growth, and then also the amount of time that it takes to move between the different cover classes of buffalo grass. And so we had, at our stakeholder workshop, we elicited information on how fast the managers thought that it would take buffalo grass to move between the different state classes. And we had a median value, a lower quartile, and upper quartile. And so that's what's represented across there. And in the either dry, slow growth or moderate, with fire, you end up with more buffalo grass on the landscape versus with the wet, fast growth, it kind of peaks out around 6,000 hectares, and that's the maximum suitable habitat in the landscape. And so it's pretty much invaded everywhere, both with and without fire. Another question that the park was interested in is how to allocate resources. And so another thing that we did was look at alternative management scenarios. And so what we're showing here is the invaded area on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is cumulative cost. And the left graph shows the scenarios without fire, while the one on the right is with fire. And the different management options related to what they're trying to manage for. So the management target could be to maintain buffalo grass at less than 1% cover on the landscape, maintain buffalo grass at 10% cover on the landscape, or to eradicate buffalo grass. And then two different methods for aerial spraying. Currently, the park only uses what's called a boom sprayer, where they can only spray patches that have greater than 50% cover. But they've been considering also getting permission to use what's called a ball sprayer, where they can spray down to 10% cover. So they could treat a lot more of the landscape with that. And so comparing these different management options, if you look like at these two right here, they have similar costs, but one of them is more invaded. And so looking at all these options, both with and without fire, going with the management goal of eradication over the 1% or 10% maintenance level actually costs less to end up with the same amount of, or costs the same amount to end up with less invaded area. And so this shows that managing for eradication is actually more cost effective than the less than 1% or less than 10% cover. And another thing to notice is that the patterns between the left and the right graph are similar. There's a difference in the scale that I haven't fixed yet, but the pattern's the same regardless that it costs more with fire and that you have more invaded acres. But that doesn't change the what we'd recommend to managers to do. Another question we asked was whether uncertainty in conditions influences results. So we looked at the sensitivity around initialization of the model related to invaded area at the end of the simulation. And with fire, there was a little more sensitivity to the model than without. But overall, the box plots all overlap. So that might not be a big concern for future research. Other questions related to implications of fire include how much of the landscape might burn in the future. And then another question was, could fire potentially alter the fire frequency in the high elevation forests that exist within the park? And so with the outputs from FARSITE, this is showing how bufflegrass might affect fire. And so the colored lines in the graph represent the area burned by iteration. So you can see there's a lot of stochasticity in what burns, but it's pretty similar as far as the amount between them. And then the black line shows average area invaded. So another thing that can be seen is that through time, when you get more bufflegrass, you get more fire on the landscape. And top to bottom, what's being shown is alternative management scenarios, with the bottom one being where there's no management happening. So you end up with more invasion. The other question, how much of the landscape might burn? This is just showing the final time step for those same 5 different scenarios and how much was burned with different environmental conditions. And so this last column is without management. And so it looks like, at least without, if you're not with this dry, slow growth, that without management, you end up with more fire on the landscape generally. And another question, do more fires burn to the forest edge? So with this, we were able to look at the perimeter of the fire and see how many of those perimeters went up to that edge of the forest. And so here we have number of fires and then the different uncertainties at the bottom, the dry, slow growth, moderate, and wet, fast growth with different initialization conditions. And one piece of information that we haven't gotten from the park yet is what the historic information is on how many burn to the edge of the forest. And so that'll be really useful to compare with these, but there doesn't seem to be a difference across our uncertainties here, at least. Another thing I'll mention is that we were using the previous version of STSIM because that's what the FARSITE linkage works with. It hasn't been migrated to work with the most recent one, but all of these analyses that I'm showing were done by exporting all the results from STSIM into R and making all these graphs and doing all that post-processing in R. So thinking about this STSIM FARSITE linkage, what were some of the pros that we found related to using that? One was that we were able to take advantage of this fire behavior model. So we were able to get realistic burns across the landscape. And we weren't reliant on historic information, which was really important in this project because fire is a novel process that we're trying to explore that's being introduced to this landscape. And we thought it had more flexibility than STSIM as far as the input parameters it could take advantage of to simulate fires on the landscape. And also provided good detailed fire output. Some of the cons associated with it was because we did end up using FARSITE. It's an older program and it didn't allow for multiprocessing on the computer, and so that made it a lot more difficult to run a lot of iterations. So we ended up only running 10 iterations of fire for each of our scenarios because of the amount of time that it took. So even with that, it ended up taking like a week to run 9 scenarios with 10 iterations. And with the current implementation, it's limited as far as what data could be fed into FARSITE. So like with fuel moisture, we're only able to feed in one value instead of different values for the different fuel models, but that's something that could, again, be modified. And another potential con is that it required a lot of increased complexity in the state classes that we had in the model. So, but we felt that it was really useful and allowed us to make some inferences as far as management decisions that we can provide back to the park. So it looks like bufflegrass in Saguaro National Park might be influenced by fire with more invaded acres and lower recoverability at the end of the simulations. Scenarios that included that aerial ball sprayer resulted in less invasion at a lower cost than not having that. And so that's another result that we can provide back to the park. But it also seemed that uncertainty in growth rates might affect that decision. And so this is where that sensitivity analysis within STSIM can be used to kind of guide what research needs there are to really be confident in making recommendations for management. So thanks.